Korea at this time, during the early first half of the 20th century, Korea was not a rich country. Yes, this is Korea's story, but it's about people. And I really think this period shows us how strong people were.
Art is a powerful means for a nation to express itself and communicate its essence to the rest of the world. Last September, a never-before-seen collection focusing on the history of modern Korean art from 1897 to 1965 went on display at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, or LACMA. The space between the modern and Korean art brought together some 130 artworks by 88 Korean artists, a painstaking process taken on by Virginia-Moon, LACMA's associate curator for Korean art. On today's show, Virginia-Moon takes us on a tour of the culture, history, and values of Korea during this turbulent period and how they were portrayed through this collection, and how the audio guide of this collection was partly narrated by none other than RM, one of the lead singers of BTS.
I'd like to just add that the artworks in this show were created during a particular part of Korea's history, but the works themselves also have a history of their own.
Oh, so Virginia, welcome to the Globalists.
Thank you.
It's wonderful to have you here, especially because I walked through the show just a couple of days before it was supposed to close. And it was mind-blowing. I loved it. But it also sort of gave me a feeling that it was a collection of things that I've never really seen put together. Different forms of art. It was art from different collections. As this show came together, what did you think the significance of this show would be?
You know, I'd say that I have to take a step back before talking about the significance. It's meaning that there were challenges to consider before doing the show. As you probably know, this is the first time a show on the modern art of Korea was done outside of Korea. But the modern period is actually really complicated. Not many people outside of Korea may know that. And so it was both the challenge of showing art that most people haven't seen, but it was also about how do you convey the complexities of a period when I can't be in that space 24/7.
The complexity that you're talking about, just in case people don't realize how complex this period was, it was from 1897 to 1965, in which you had the Japanese occupation of Korea and the Korean War, which are two of the most major events that happened to Korea in its modern period.
That's right.
Even those two events in itself are complex, and to put them all together in one show?
Yes, in fact, those two major events make up pretty much the modern period. Not only that, they're pretty much back to back. The thing is, it's one thing to show the artworks, but it's another, how do you convey the fact that it was challenging? How do you convey the struggle? Because really the works themselves don't show that directly. So when you ask about your experience in entering the space, it was very important in thinking through this show, to me, to bring out all the mediums that existed during this period, namely the oils, which newly came in via Japan, inks continued, and sculpture and photography. You know, the showing of all four has never been done. While it's quite common when exhibitions in the US focus on a time period, that was important to bring out to me because, in fact, they all existed, and by doing so, when the works were installed, and this actually goes to answer your question, you could see, sure enough, that all the works are having conversations with each other. That you could see that even though they're different mediums, the artists were all struggling with similar issues, and they did it through their mediums. And so you see that. And that, to me, it was remarkable. I've never seen that even in Korea.
Yeah. I mean, it's for artworks that reflect such a very turbulent period. They weren't wrapped up in the events of the time. It was more a deeper look into what was happening to Koreans, in a more inner way than it was the outer events.
Well, that's true to a certain extent, but in the art world, I would say that it was a pretty seismic encounter in the early 20th century when, with the colonization of Korea, at that time there were no art schools in Korea. And so anybody who wanted to continue to be an artist, really had to go to Japan. And by doing so, because Japan was very much interested in learning the arts of Europe, the Korean artists there got sort of an edited, filtered version of European art. But it was sudden. And I call this a forced modernization. Because of that, one of the biggest issues that I think it has to be remembered for artists at least, they had to make a choice. Do I want to accept and use, say, for example, oils? Or do I want to stay with ink? But further than that, what I find so amazing and I have so much respect for, and it's an impossible thing to do, is that it's apparent to me that the artists at this time put upon themselves the pressure to try to figure out what the future of Korean art should be. Now that blows my mind because that's an impossible question to answer.
You talked about how it impressed you. What does it say about Korea or Koreans at that point in history?
In the Joseon Dynasty, which is the last traditional dynasty before the modern era, which starts in the early 20th century, paintings were the only form that were considered fine art. So when Korean artists were going to Japan to get training, not only did the concept of oils and the mediums of oils come in, so did sculpture.
Photography, I think.
Photography came first.
Before sculptures?
Yes.
Really?
Sculptures actually came 20 years later compared to oils. The reason why sculptures came into the country nearly 2 decades later is because up until that point, Koreans only associated sculptures with Buddhist sculpture.
Ah.
And it was affiliated with religion.
Yes.
And so you can imagine it was quite hard for the general populace to absorb the fact of Korean sculptural nudes, busts. Just completely different. It takes some time. Not only the needing of different kinds of materials and so on, but there was also that conceptual acceptance that had to take place, which was slow.
I mean, it does sort of show how alien some of this must have felt.
To be an artist, I think, generally speaking, in any country is not an easy thing. And certainly Korea at this time, during the early first half of the 20th century, Korea was not a rich country. And despite that, when I see that these artists, they just had to do what they had to do, when all these other economic, political, social indecisions and chaos is going on around them. When I see the artworks, these are examples to me of a small group, because after all, it's a small group of people on the Korean peninsula before it was divided that not only had to do it, but I would say today, they did it during one of the most difficult times in Korea. And so when I give my walkthroughs, at the end of the walkthrough, I always like to make the point that first of all, yes, this is Korea's story, but it's about people. And that exhibition was about these artists' resilience. And I really think this period shows us how strong people were.
It does. And I think one of the mediums that you included, especially photography at the time wasn't really considered art, was it?
No, it wasn't. But in fact, photography was the first, well, let's call it a technology, because it happens because of the camera. The first medium, now we call it an art form, that entered the country late 19th century. Originally, it was invited to come in by the royal courts in order to document evidence of modern change. Many of the photographers in Korea at that time worked for the newspapers, in particular 동아 일보. But the handful of artists that we showed in the exhibition, I mean, this is what they did on their downtime. I mean, at the time at least, it was what you saw, what one saw. I was really proud to be able to get to know people who owned such collections and to have them let us, trust us to show it. It was very important to me in this show, like I said earlier, to bring out all four mediums.
Yeah.
And with photography never having the light of day, it really was at that time the best visual evidence we had about what was going on. And it was really significant to me because really in general in the US, when it comes to photographs, I mean, they're of tragedies from the war.
True.
And yeah, sure, that's very important. But you know, people also just lived lives. And I think that's important to bring out.
Yeah. If photographs, I think, showed in part realism, but in a different way from just showing war photographs. The part of your show of 신여성, the new woman, showed through the artwork in terms of this was not actually what it was, but the meaning behind the work. It's portraits of women as scientists, as people that are in society taking on social roles, which, as you said, was a little shocking because women in that time weren't scientists, weren't a part of the social structure outside of the home. So tell us a little bit about that aspect of the show.
There are people who simply misunderstand it and kind of refer to it as Korea's first feminist movement.
Yeah.
And that's absolutely not true. In the sense that 신여성 definitely allowed women in the country to get an education officially for the first time. Great. But in fact, they were allowed that because this was a way to figure out how to utilize the women in the country as part of the modernization process. And it's been hard, at least, for the time that we had to look for it, to find evidence to say, because of the 신여성 period, female artists emerged. So the artworks that we were able to choose there were very clearly tied to this 신여성, new woman movement. And when they were installed, I was, just looking at everything at once, I was pleasantly surprised how many women were depicted as subjects. We had a total of 8 female artists in the show, which may not sound like very much, but actually it was the first time that these female artists were recognized by name. Like I said, just looking at everything, I thought to myself, I could have packaged this as a feminist show. Okay, we'll leave that for another day. But that's how much, whether it's socially intentional, whether it's subject accident, I was quite surprised at the female component represented in the show.
That is quite surprising. I heard about your explanation about how these women are depicted as scientists and so on, because the men of that time believed that education for women would lead to these educated mothers who would produce the next generation of
simply
scientists.
put,
And
Yeah.
and they could be women. I mean, you could have a next generation of scientists and, leaders that are women, although they probably didn't think of that at the time. But the very fact that they were there, whether that was the original purpose or not, did start a certain type of ball rolling.
Absolutely. I would say with no reference to real evidence that was the turning point when the truth came out that Korean women are dynamic, are powerful, and really question the Confucian notion of a male hierarchy social system. And it's been really nice to see.
I think it is nice to see too.
Some of the works, in fact 10, chosen by the singer RM of the BTS group, who has a serious interest in art himself and is an art collector, has provided audio recordings in both English and Korean.
The man in this portrait is Emperor Gojong, who was formerly known as King Gojong, the last king of the Joseon dynasty.
Now, what I'm very curious about, I understand of the audio guide, a part of the audio guide was narrated by none other than RM of BTS. Now, how did this come about?
Well, first of all, he wanted to do it. As many people may or may not know, he has his own private interest in art collecting, and he is known to go to many museums all over the world. He's a friend of a colleague of mine at the National Museum and approached her and said, I really want to do this. He knew of our show. It was very unexpected. And I said, great. I actually was very curious to see what works he wanted to talk about.
Oh, so the 10 works
He chose.
chose to?
Yes.
Oh, my goodness.
He chose them. And, I can't deny that it appealed to a whole new audience.
I would think so.
And that actually I found exciting. People who probably normally may not visit LACMA came to LACMA, many just to hear the 10. People who didn't know what Korean art was before they went to the exhibition would walk out knowing 10. He recorded it in Korean and English, and he did it in his own recording studio.
Yeah, I heard it was great audio.
I still thank him for not only doing that, but by doing so, really spotlighting Korean art in a way that it hadn't before.
I think he deserves the thanks. But he might have gotten them there, but getting them to really understand and appreciate it was your show. So, a collaboration, I would say. But this exhibit itself, what do you think? What was the reaction from the U.S. audience, and how was it received?
I must have given hundreds of walkthroughs, both by private request and by public engagement. And there wasn't a single walkthrough where, when I finished, people really felt something positive. People felt that they could better understand. In short, they just really loved it. And I felt the genuineness of it. And to me, every time people would say that to me, it actually blew my mind. But by doing this show, LACMA, we were able to share, introduce Korean art on a huge scale. And people were interested.
Yeah.
And they walked away being satisfied in general.
In general.
Yeah.
On a personal level, for you, a curator of Korean descent, is there a special meaning for you?
The special meaning has to do more with the fact that, when I started, Korean art was not taught in colleges or universities, was not offered. There was, I would say, there was recognition that Korean art was important when we think about East Asian art, since Chinese art was established and Japanese art history was established, but no action to come through with it. I did it because I felt we need to do this. I was involved with trying to help establish Korean studies in my undergraduate college, and it was during that time that I realized the topic wasn't taught because there were no qualified people to teach it, because there were no courses that were taught. It was the endless chicken and egg.
Yeah.
So I decided I wanted to teach, that I would somehow learn it so I could teach it. But the curator job was definitely a different turn. It was unexpected, and who knew? I love it.
Yeah. When you talk about that, the Chinese and Japanese, it also sort of, in a way, Korea was also in the space between
Absolutely.
China and Korea, and it never really was able to own that space between, I think. And I think, your exhibit was one of the rare shows that I felt like people would get it, would get something beyond the Buddha sculptures, and they're wonderful, but Buddha's statues and the gold crown, and
Thanks for saying that. But your bringing up the title reminds me that, not all people quite understood that I named it The Space Between because this was a show on the modern period, and the modern period sits between the traditional and the contemporary, and it hadn't come out yet. And so that's why I called it The Space Between. But in this particular show, I think I felt it would be too limited to just present our public with modern, from modern to modern. I thought it had to have a back door, slightly giving a peek into the contemporary, because outside of Korea, Korean contemporary art is quite better known than other periods in Korean art. But I also know because modern art of Korea hasn't really come out, many people don't really know what came before. And for that reason, I think that this period, it was more than timely for it to be addressed.
Yeah.
But that's why I gave sort of a back door in the final section of the show to really say, well, here we begin.
To really point out the very crucial lineage that led to the contemporary art of Korea that is blowing a lot of people away. But, the space between was the show. What's next?
I had no idea when I titled the show The Space Between how the title could take on a life of its own and apply in so many ways. I think as I was born in the United States, but I do consider that I straddle both cultures. I think it's long past time, and I'm happy to do what I do because I think there's so much more about Korean art that can come out that hasn't so far for one reason or another. And I can't wait to be able to share that and bring that out.
Well, we will be looking forward to it. And with your next show, we hope that you will come back and talk to us again.
Thank you for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you very much. And that's it for me. I will be back next week with another globalist who is putting Korea on the map. Sun Jie out.